Let's talk about Nilah. Nilah is the latest skirmisher coming to League of Legends, designed from the beginning to be a new melee botlaner, something the champion design team hasn't attempted intentionally in a very long time. With selfless utility baked into her damage-oriented kit, Nilah is intended to play nice with her teammates, but the specific kit she's been given has left us with a lot of complexities to discuss. As usual, I got together with my community to test out Nilah, throwing as many roles, builds, and playstyles at her within the very limited time that we had to work with. Remember, as always, that it's impossible to have learned everything there is to know pre-release, so please treat this video as a primer to guide your own learning rather than a definitive guide. In this video, we'll be covering Nilah's abilities, skill order and combos, synergies and counterpicks, purpose and macro responsibilities, draft, and runes and itemization. There's a lot to cover with this champion. Nilah's passive has two components that empower herself and her allies. Both will sound complicated, but the ideas behind them are simple. First, when Nilah last hits a minion, her and her nearest ally receive 50% of the XP that would be lost to sharing. This means that when she's in a duo lane, she and her support receive close to solo lane experience. 8 minions grant level 2 instead of the usual 9, and in the unrealistic case that the melee Nilah farms perfectly, her lane achieves level 3 on the third wave's cannon minion. She's almost certain to hit level 6 in the duo lane first, which is a big deal. Second, Nilah empowers the healing and shielding of her allies under very specific rules. Nilah always receives 10% bonus healing and 20% bonus shielding from her allies. I'll be referring to this value as the bonus heal shield. If Nilah is healed or shielded, the ally that granted the effect to her receives the bonus heal shield as well. If an ally within Nilah's range heals or shields themselves, Nilah and her ally gain the bonus heal shield. The wiki claims that an ally must heal or shield only themselves for Nilah to gain the bonus heal shield, but this is incorrect. Nilah does not boost her own self-healing or lifesteal. Think of this as effectively a forbidden idol aura. Bonus shields last the same duration as their base shield, up to a maximum of 4 seconds. Nilah's Q is a linear skill shot that deals physical damage to all enemies hit and empowers Nilah if it lands. Importantly, Nilah's Q can actually damage turrets, and its damage is increased by 1% per 1% crit chance. On striking an enemy, Nilah's auto attacks are empowered for 4 seconds, granting her bonus range and bonus attack speed, causing her attacks to strike in a cone and deal slightly more damage. All champions take full damage from the cone attacks, but minions take reduced damage and monsters take even less. Nilah's Q also has a passive that rewards her for building crit. She gains healing from a percentage of post-mitigation damage dealt by autos and Q, which converts overhealing to a shield, as well as passive percent armor penetration. If Nilah has 0% crit, the values of each of these effects is 0%. She has no Q passive unless she has crit chance. Nilah's W is a buff that causes her to dodge basic attacks and reduce incoming magic damage for the duration. She also gains movement speed and is ghosted. The dodge works exactly the same way as Jax's E. If Nilah touches an ally while W is active, they also gain its buff for a shorter duration. This is a simple but powerful defensive steroid with a long cooldown. Nilah's E is a targeted dash that deals physical damage to all enemies hit. Nilah can target all allied or enemy units, excluding wards, and always dashes a fixed distance. This ability stores 2 charges, but to compensate, the charge cooldown is long and the range is short. Nilah can cast Q or R during the dash. If she casts Q, it strikes along E's path. E can dash over walls, but its limited range makes that difficult to perform consistently, and it is an auto reset, which stops mattering once your attack speed increases. Nilah's ultimate damages and pulls nearby enemies towards her, healing nearby allies for a percentage of the damage dealt. Nilah deals some damage over the cast time, and then a much larger burst on the pull. You cannot cast any other abilities or attack during R's cast, so you cannot dash, but you can still flash. Like her Q passive, Nilah's R healing converts overhealing to a shield with the same value, with each tick lasting for 6 seconds. Just keep in mind that the damage is necessary to achieve healing, and that the shield property means that you don't always have to wait for your teammates to get low. As we move into Nilah's combos, I want you to consider that Nilah's stickiness is surprisingly poor. Her dash range is low unless she wants to spend an E-charge on a minion, which causes her to lose to enemy mobility because her E-charge cooldown is very high. So unless Nilah can approach without spending E, she wants to deal as much damage as fast as possible with as few animations as possible, or she risks her enemy escaping her auto range. EQ is essential because Q has a cast time that locks Nilah in place. Bypassing this cast time is necessary when chasing. EQR dumps heavy damage on the moment of Nilah's engage. This requires fast keystrokes, but not precise keystrokes, because the order doesn't actually matter as long as you have started your dash. To gain as much distance as possible, declare an E from out of range, flash, and cast QR. Q flash causes Q to cast from your new position. The direction does not change. R flash is useful for following escapes, but please never R flash just for the burst damage. You need your entire ultimate to land, or you lose heavy utility. Fortunately, unlike the last few releases, Nilah has an obviously correct full max skill order, so there's not any complexity in allocating your skill points. Q damage is essential as a first max, then E's cooldown becomes necessary. W's buff is strong enough, and its uptime doesn't dramatically increase with ranks, so it's a one-point wonder. Could you maybe argue that most of Q's strength is in its AD ratio, and so you'd rather hold off on ranking it up until you get an item? Sure, you could argue that, except Q's ratio is a total AD ratio, so it always has value. We have a simple QEW skill order. So, did Riot succeed in making a melee bot laner? I think so. Nilah has the same properties that make Yasuo, Cho'Gath, and Jax capable of playing a bot lane phase. Despite being a melee champion, she has good protection from ranged champions and the means to threaten them back. Her passive alone is a huge dual lane strength. She is a bot laner, but that doesn't mean she's only a bot laner. Nilah almost released as an outstanding jungler with a very fast clear, which did get nerfed while she was still on the PvE. Her clear health is inherently tied to her clear speed because she lacks natural early sustain. Now that her clear is slower, she is unhealthy, which means she lacks options. Since we've seen the potential, keep an eye out for jungle Nilah a few patches down the road, but for now, it's a for fun pick. I also believe solo lane Nilah has some merit. The downside is obvious. If you put her in the top lane, then she has no passive, and her passive is her greatest consistency tool. But there's some natural safety in her kit that could do a lot of work into the right matchup. 350 auto range with Q's buff gives her poke against melee champions, W is obviously powerful, and if fighting in the minion wave, E can be used as an escape. There is no chance you can just blind pick top lane Nilah, but I'm convinced it's legitimate as a situational counterpick. Nilah is an aggressive teamfight skirmisher who accelerates her team's econ and empowers their healing and shielding, contributing equal parts utility and damage. Obviously you want Nilah in your teamfights. The moment of her ultimate is too valuable for her entire team to keep her locked into a side lane. However, a bot lane Nilah can warp the game significantly to get to that point. During the lane phase, she encourages her support to plant their feet in the lane to optimize their own bonus XP, so the support tends to roam much less frequently. Once the lane phase ends, Nilah is the worst in role at contesting the mid wave. While other short-ranged ADCs can threaten their long-ranged opponents off the wave, Nilah struggles with this in the general case because she loses so hard to mobility and disengage after spending E on a minion. Her range allows her to match mid waves in many cases, but she's not optimized by approaching from the front, and she won't be generating first move for her team unless she's already grossly ahead. The solutions are then to either swarm mid, which can easily make the game messy but which can get Nilah a huge ult engage, or to embrace Nilah's boosted XP and flank nature, putting her in the side lane for a shove and collapse. Now obviously I'm not trying to say you should never put Nilah mid lane in the mid game. Sometimes you do just need someone who can passively farm and neutralize, sometimes her bot lane opponents are vulnerable to her post lane, and sometimes she'll have bad side lane matchups. But I'm certain there's a decent number of situations in which you should assign Nilah to the side lane and keep her mid laner in the mid lane in order to unlock her teamfight. Since Nilah's utility is a necessary part of her kit and that utility is based on the damage dealt, Nilah needs to be ahead. But getting ahead requires a patient playstyle, especially in the bot lane. You cannot ever afford to take free damage because you need to be prepared for an all-in using your level advantage. Take what your opponents give you by farming with Q, but don't use Q if you don't need its buff to farm because its mana cost adds up. You typically have to wait for the level 3 spike because most lanes don't hit 3 when the third wave hits their turret. That's a huge moment for Nilah. You will be 3 first, you will be 6 first, your accelerated XP is your greatest contribution early, just be patient. Top lane Nilah isn't nearly as all-in reliant. In fact, she's the opposite, playing for poke against short-ranged opponents. But since her mobility is targeted and her defenses have long downtimes, she also needs to be patient and intentional with the trades she takes. Don't let the game get explosive until you make it so. So how do you actually deal with a Nilah? How do you prevent her from swinging a fight with her excellent ultimate? The answer is to wall her out. We've established that Nilah's dash range is poor, but keep in mind that this also means she's very powerful and sticky if she's ever allowed to just walk up without spending a dash. The best answer to her is to poke her out of lane. Remember that she needs last hits to gain her bonus experience. But if that's not an option for whatever reason, her limitations come when she needs a targeted dash to get in. You can wall her out by playing heavy range and disengage, or you can put a stronger duelist on anti-flank duty. Clumping up is not protection as long as Nilah's team is coordinated. If you're a solo queue only player, you can skip this section, but for the amateur, clash, and flex players, let's talk about drafting Nilah. Had she released with her jungle strength intact, I would say she's easily a B1 flex pick because you could always fall back on the jungle role if she's given hard lane matchups. Because her jungle is playable but not strong, instead Nilah is a counter pick. You don't want to slam Nilah and then have to lane into semi-mobile artillery champions. Ezreal and Ziggs in particular are hell lanes if played competently, and I can't imagine it's fun to lane into a Seraphine or Karthus either. I expect Nilah's best supports to be Taric, Yuumi, Senna, and Tahm Kench. Taric synergizes to the point that I think if you allow Nilah and Taric to be picked together, you lose. I want to say proper disengage and range prevents this combo from being picked because they have no answers to hard lanes, but I also haven't seen exactly what happens when an excellent Nilah Taric gets a stun off Nilah's minion dash. I do not know what top lane Nilah's good matchups are, but I do know that they're immobile. You won't outduel a Fiora or Jax. You won't beat a ranged top laner because range is your only advantage. It will be necessary to learn which side lane matchups Nilah wins at what stages, especially since I've already made my case for side lane ADC Nilah. As a general point, Nilah likes it when her support is an XP-reliant enchanter like Renata, Zillion, and Seraphine, or a support who likes to speedrun to level 6 like Pyke. But no matter the role she plays, Nilah also likes to be paired with self-heals or shields. Aatrox, Swain, Sylas, Rost, Lilia, Nautilus, Fiora, Zac. Imagine giving any of these champions a heal shield item that they can't normally purchase. But above all, Nilah can function without her optimal synergies as long as she's placed into a flank or dive teamfight comp. If you've picked Nilah, you want to teamfight or snowball. The perfect Nilah comp is a flank comp with multiple self-healers, putting Nilah in the bot lane with a core synergy support versus a low to mid-ranged opponent, and a side lane matchup she can fight later in the game. Good luck finding all of that at once though. Before I talk about Nilah's itemization, I want to remind you of our goals and some properties of her kit. Nilah's Q buff grants her more than enough attack speed and is a level scaling effect, so I believe this gives us the green light to optimize Nilah for the moment of her ultimate by stacking raw AD. Nilah has 4 crit scalings: her Q damage, her Q passive percent pen, her Q passive lifesteal, and her R percent healing. Obviously, these are intended to push her towards crit, implying that her core stats are simply crit and AD. But I would like to point out that each of these crit effects are not noticeably strong on just one crit item. Rushing crit is not overwhelmingly stronger than all of our non-crit options. And remember that sometimes we have to play the side lane to gain access to a good ultimate in the first place, something that the crit mythics don't always optimize, which means blindly following our core stats might be misleading in Nilah's case. I am convinced that Nilah has versatile itemization that must change on a game-to-game basis. On screen now are the core early build paths. Blade of the Ruined King is unquestionably the best side lane option, granting Nilah the most dueling power possible. It slightly weakens her teamfight later in exchange for being able to make it to the teamfight. Top lane Nilah should always build Bork, bot lane Nilah should think ahead to what her mid game will look like. The best pure scaling comes from simply rushing your shield bow into LDR or BT. Nilah's Q passive and multiplicative stacking of percent pen doesn't change anything meaningful in the typical collector versus LDR debate. However, for optimal bot lane snowball, Nilah can use the Samira strategy of rushing a serrated Dirk before her mythic, which then must be completed into collector. I personally find the attack speed of Phantom Dancer to be luxurious, but maybe in the future will value its move speed highly. If Infinity Edge can be purchased by third item, then do. Otherwise, since Nilah is a melee champion without Tryndamere level defenses, we need defensive itemization. It's the standard crit finishers: Bloodthirster, Guardian Angel, Maw if you're running Gale Force, maybe a Frozen Heart or Force of Nature at the end. I have to advocate for last item, Mikhail's. It's an extremely strong endgame MR option when you consider how much healing an optimized Nilah outputs, and if you're very mechanically proficient, you can use it as a better QSS. Because I'm a maniac, I'll also share a work-in-progress theory craft. I believe that if Nilah can discover a safe and consistent 3-item mythicless core that doesn't heavily sacrifice damage, then she can build Moonstone later. This build currently does not exist. My best candidate is Bork LDR Bloodthirster into Moonstone, but this is not teamfight optimized and is cripplingly light on defenses. I bring it up because the potential of endgame healing is extreme and appealing. I just don't have a way of making it work yet. Runes are much simpler. Take Conqueror to optimize raw AD alongside the standard melee runes, Triumph, Legend's Tenacity, and Last Stand. If Tenacity is unnecessary, then Alacrity optimizes damage and Q passive lifesteal. I avoid Lethal Tempo because of the value I place on Q's attack speed buff alongside the attack speed from your rush item, but I won't rule out that there could be points in a game when it's stronger. Fleet Footwork sounds appealing for surviving hard bot lanes, but the healing against minions is so heavily nerfed that it cannot achieve that purpose. My preferred secondary page is Resolve with an invariable Revitalize. Conditioning is the generalist pairing, but Bone Plating can be situationally good in the top lane. I think it's hard to argue against this page. I don't see the value of Inspiration Econ or Domination Sorcery damage in this case. So that's Nilah, the Joy Unbound. Her simple active abilities are deceiving. There were so many nuances to go over, so many options available to her, so many ways in which she can potentially warp how games play out, and excitingly, so much to explore about her place in the game. But of course, even everything I've talked about can't possibly be everything there is to know about Nilah. I encourage you to take what you've learned here and develop it further, and please report back with what you learned to help everyone improve. I hope this video helps you to spread unceasing and unending joy on the Rift when Nilah releases.